Your calculations are flawed, Professor. The equation proves otherwise.
The lecture hall erupted in vicious laughter as the textbook slammed into Amara Johnson's skull, sending her stumbling forward while 200 students watched her blue dress ripple like a flag of surrender. Maybe if you spent less time pretending to belong here and more time in remedial classes where people like you should be, Professor Whitman's voice dripped with academic poison, each word calculated to wound, you'd finally understand that some minds just aren't built for excellence. But as Amara's trembling hands gathered her scattered papers from the floor, papers containing solutions that would revolutionize economic theory, the massive oak doors exploded open with the force of divine intervention. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding hallway light, his blue suit worth more than most students' entire education, his presence transforming the lecture hall into a courtroom where privilege was about to be sentenced. The laughter died instantly, choked off by collective recognition, as David Johnson, the David Johnson whose signature could bankrupt corporations, whose single phone call had once saved a nation's economy, spoke 5 words that would destroy a dynasty built on discrimination. I believe you owe my wife an apology. In that moment, as Professor Whitman's face drained of color and his son Bradley shrank into his seat, everyone in that room realized they hadn't just been mocking a struggling student. They'd been tormenting the woman who'd built a $1 million nonprofit from nothing, who advised governors on economic policy, who'd chosen to return to school under her maiden name because she wanted to earn her PhD without her billionaire husband's shadow, only to discover that sometimes the most expensive education is learning just how cheap human cruelty can be. The chalk moved across the blackboard like lightning conducting truth through limestone, each equation flowing into the next with the precision of someone who'd been born speaking the language of advanced mathematics. Grace Okonkwo, still wearing her faded maid's uniform with the small bleach stain on the left shoulder, stood in Richard Hartley's private study solving a problem that had stumped MIT's entire theoretical physics department for 3 months. His daughter Emma sat frozen at her desk, her PhD thesis scattered across mahogany wood, watching the woman who'd cleaned their toilets for 5 years casually unravel the Hartley-Chen Paradox, the very problem her dissertation depended on solving. Richard himself stood in the doorway, his morning coffee sliding from nerveless fingers to shatter against Italian marble, the sound like an exclamation point to his world turning upside down. 5 minutes ago, he'd been laughing, actually laughing, as he told his business partner on the phone about his simple-minded maid, who couldn't even remember which cleaning products to use, who spoke in broken English despite living in America for years, who needed instructions repeated 3 times before understanding the simplest tasks. The words were still echoing in the room when Grace had quietly approached Emma, glanced at the equations that had reduced the brilliant 26-year-old to tears, and asked in perfect, unaccented English, "Would you like me to show you where your logic chain breaks down?" The morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated Grace's face as she worked, revealing what Richard had never bothered to see in 5 years, the slight squint of someone processing complex information, the subtle movement of lips counting through calculations, the confident posture of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She wasn't just solving the equation, she was teaching it, breaking down each component so Emma could understand not just the answer but the thinking behind it, the elegant simplicity hidden within apparent chaos. "The mistake everyone makes," Grace said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen this error 1,000 times, "is assuming the wave function collapses uniformly. But if you account for quantum entanglement at the molecular level..." She wrote another line, and Emma gasped, seeing suddenly what months of work had hidden from her. If you're watching this unfold on Acts of Depth, you know we believe that the most extraordinary people often hide in the most ordinary places, that brilliance doesn't always wear a suit, and that judgment based on appearance is the fastest way to reveal your own ignorance. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what happens next will make you question every assumption you've ever made about intelligence, worth, and the price of prejudice. Grace had started working for the Hartley family on a clear Tuesday morning 5 years ago, responding to an advertisement for a live-in housekeeper that offered below minimum wage but included room and board. She'd stood at their door in a second-hand dress, speaking carefully broken English, playing the part of someone who'd never seen the inside of a classroom past 6th grade. Richard had hired her on the spot, pleased to find someone so desperate for work that she'd accept half what he'd paid his previous maid, someone so seemingly simple that she'd never questioned the longer hours or the degrading tasks he added to her duties. What Richard didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn, was that Grace Okonkwo had once been Dr. Grace Okonkwo, with dual PhDs in theoretical physics and applied mathematics from Cambridge University. She'd published papers that redefined quantum mechanics, had been invited to lecture at the Sorbonne, had been called the most brilliant mathematical mind of her generation by Stephen Hawking himself. But that was before the accident, before the lawsuit that had drained every penny she'd saved, before the medical bills that had forced her to sell everything, before the visa complications that had left her unable to work in her field while her immigration status remained in limbo. She'd taken the maid job not just for survival but for anonymity, a place to disappear while she waited for her legal situation to resolve. The Hartley mansion in Westchester became her hiding place, a refuge where she could be invisible, where no one would think to look for a woman who'd once solved the Millennium Prize problems in her spare time. She cleaned their floors while composing symphonies of mathematics in her mind, scrubbed their toilets while mentally writing papers she couldn't publish, cooked their meals while solving problems that would have made their heads spin. The broken English had been a shield, a way to ensure Richard would never see her as anything more than furniture that moved. She'd listened to him on his business calls, making deals based on mathematical models so flawed a first-year statistics student would have laughed. She'd watched him berate employees for errors while making bigger ones himself. She'd endured his casual cruelty, his jokes about her intelligence, his performative displays of superiority, all while knowing she could destroy his entire worldview with a single conversation. But it was Emma who'd finally broken through Grace's carefully constructed walls. The girl was brilliant in her own right, pursuing a PhD in theoretical physics at 26, the youngest candidate in her program. But she'd hit a wall with her thesis, a problem that required the kind of mathematical intuition that couldn't be taught, only recognized in those who possessed it naturally. Grace had watched her struggle for weeks, coming home from university defeated, crying in her room, beginning to doubt her own capabilities. The study fell silent except for the sound of chalk on board and Emma's rapid breathing as she watched Grace work through the equation with the casual efficiency of someone writing a grocery list. Richard remained frozen in the doorway, his Italian leather shoes standing in the spreading coffee puddle, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the maid he dismissed as barely functional for half a decade. "You're using Schrödinger's equation as your base," Grace continued, her voice carrying the patient tone of a professor who'd taught this material countless times, but the Hartley-Chen Paradox requires a modified approach that accounts for temporal displacement in quantum fields. "Here, let me show you." She drew a new diagram, connecting concepts that Emma's professors hadn't even considered, building bridges between theories that existed in different academic universes. Emma's hands shook as she took notes, her laptop forgotten, reverting to pencil and paper to capture what was unfolding before her. But Professor Morrison said that temporal displacement was incompatible with quantum entanglement at this scale, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace smiled, the first genuine smile Richard had ever seen on her face. Professor Morrison is working from Kellerman's 1987 framework. But Kellerman himself revised that theory in 2003 after the Budapest experiments. The revision was published in Hungarian, which might be why your professor missed it. She switched to Hungarian for a moment, quoting the paper from memory, then translated it back to English with perfect fluency. Richard's legs finally gave out, and he sank into the leather chair by the door, his mind racing through 5 years of memories that suddenly needed recontextualization. Every time he'd spoken slowly to Grace, explaining simple tasks as if to a child. Every time he'd laughed with his golf buddies about his dim-witted help. Every time he'd used her as an example of why minimum wage was too high for people who can barely think. The humiliation was so complete it felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. "How?" he finally managed to croak out, his voice stripped of its usual commanding tone. "How do you know this?" Grace turned to him, and for the first time in 5 years, she looked him directly in the eyes. The subservient posture was gone, replaced by the bearing of someone who'd lectured to Nobel laureates. "The same way your daughter knows it, Mr. Hartley. I learned it. I studied it. I mastered it." She turned back to the board, adding another equation. The only difference is that you assumed my skin color and my job title were indicators of my intelligence. Emma looked between her father and Grace, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The time you fixed my laptop when it crashed, she said slowly. You recovered my data using command line restoration that even IT couldn't figure out. And when I was struggling with differential equations sophomore year, you left that textbook on my desk, the one with exactly the chapters one needed bookmarked. Grace nodded, returning to the equation. You reminded me of myself at your age. Brilliant but doubting yourself because the world keeps telling you there's only one way to be smart. Your father's voice in your head telling you you're not good enough, just like voices told me I didn't belong in academia because of where I came from. Richard stood up, his face flushed with anger born from humiliation. You've been lying to us for 5 years. Pretending to be something you're not. That's fraud. I could have you arrested. Grace laughed, a sound that filled the room with unexpected warmth. For what crime, exactly? Being overqualified? I've cleaned your house spotlessly, cooked your meals perfectly, never stolen so much as a penny despite handling cash and valuables daily. My only deception was letting you believe what you wanted to believe about me. She turned to face him fully. You never asked about my education. You never wondered about my story. You saw a black woman willing to clean for minimum wage and created an entire narrative about who I must be. She pulled out her phone and showed something to Emma, a Wikipedia page that made the young woman gasp. It was Grace's academic biography, complete with her publications, her awards, her groundbreaking theorems. At the bottom, a note, current status, unknown. Dr. Okonkwo disappeared from public life in 2019 following personal tragedy. My daughter died, Grace said simply, the words hanging in the air like a physical presence. Leukemia. She was 12. The experimental treatment wasn't covered by insurance, so I liquidated everything, my savings, my pension, my home. When she died anyway, I had nothing left but debt and a grief so heavy I couldn't carry it and my career at the same time. She turned back to the board, adding another line to the equation. Your house became my refuge, a place where I could exist without thinking, where I could be nobody instead of somebody who'd lost everything. Emma stood up, tears streaming down her face, and did something that shocked both Richard and Grace. She hugged the older woman, holding her tight despite the maid uniform, despite the 5 years of artificial distance, despite everything. I'm so sorry, she whispered. For everything. For how we treated you. For what you've lost. Grace stood rigid in Emma's embrace for a moment before her shoulders slowly relaxed, her hand coming up to pat the younger woman's back with maternal gentleness. When they separated, Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears while Grace's face had softened from its professional mask into something more vulnerable, more human than Richard had ever seen in 5 years of her service. Your thesis defense is in 3 weeks, Grace said, turning back to the board with renewed purpose. We have work to do if you're going to present something that will revolutionize the field rather than just earn you a degree. She picked up a different colored chalk, mapping out a study plan that would have cost thousands of dollars from a private tutor. Tomorrow, we'll start with the mathematical proofs. Thursday, we'll tackle the experimental design flaws in your current methodology. Richard found his voice again, his tone shifting from anger to something more calculating. Wait. You're still planning to clean my house? After this? He gestured at the board covered in equations that looked like an alien language to him. Why would someone with your qualifications continue being a maid? Grace looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. Because unlike you, Mr. Hartley, I understand that work has dignity regardless of its nature. I've heard you on your calls, making million-dollar deals based on algorithms you don't understand, using mathematical models you can't explain, succeeding not through intelligence but through inherited wealth and connections. She picked up the cleaning supplies she'd set down when she'd entered the study. At least when I clean your toilet, the work is honest. The insult landed like a physical blow. Richard's face went from red to purple, his hands clenching into fists. How dare you, I built my company from nothing. I'm a self-made millionaire. Your father gave you a $5 million loan, Grace said calmly, organizing the scattered papers on Emma's desk with practiced efficiency. Your college roommate's father was on the board at Goldman Sachs, which is how you got your first job despite graduating with a 2.3 GPA. Your wife's family connections secured your initial investors. I know this because you've told the story dozens of times on the phone, though the loan gets smaller and your GPA gets higher with each telling. Emma looked at her father with new eyes, seeing him perhaps for the first time without the filter of daughterly admiration. Is that true, Dad? You always said you started with nothing but determination. Richard's silence was answer enough. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him as his carefully constructed self-image crumbled. Grace continued cleaning, but her movements were different now, not subservient but purposeful, someone choosing to do a task rather than being forced to do it. The tragedy, Grace said, wiping down the desk with the same precision she'd used to solve the equation, is that you're not actually stupid, Mr. Hartley. You have good instincts for business, a talent for networking, an ability to see market patterns others miss. But you've spent so much energy maintaining your superiority complex that you've never developed your actual strengths. She moved to the bookshelf, dusting volumes Richard had never opened. These books on advanced mathematics, quantum theory, economic modeling, they're all for show, aren't they? You bought them to look intelligent rather than to become intelligent. Richard wanted to protest, but the words died in his throat. She was right. The books were props in the theater of his success, like the abstract art he couldn't interpret and the wine collection he couldn't distinguish. His entire life had been about appearing smart rather than being smart, about maintaining an image that grew more exhausting with each passing year. Teach me, Emma said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Not just the thesis. Everything. I want to learn to think like you do, to see patterns the way you do. She turned to her father. And you should learn too, Dad. Really learn, not just pretend. Grace paused in her cleaning, considering. I charge $500 an hour for private tutoring. That was my rate at Cambridge, adjusted for inflation. But for Emma. She looked at the young woman with genuine fondness. I'll teach you for free, on one condition. You use your privilege and platform to help other brilliant minds who are dismissed because of their appearance or circumstances. Your thesis isn't just about solving an equation, it's about opening doors for others. And me? Richard asked, his voice smaller than Emma had ever heard it. What would it cost for you to teach me? Grace studied him for a long moment. This man who dismissed her intelligence, mocked her accent, treated her as less than human while she'd kept his household running flawlessly. For you, Mr. Hartley, the price isn't money. It's humility. Every lesson begins with you saying, I don't know, and meaning it. Every session requires you to admit your ignorance without shame. Every breakthrough demands you acknowledge that intelligence comes in forms you've been trained not to recognize. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the study as Grace finished the core proof that would become the foundation of Emma's thesis. The board was now covered edge to edge with elegant mathematics, each line building toward a conclusion that would challenge 50 years of accepted theory. Emma had filled 3 notebooks with notes, her hand cramping from writing, her mind racing to keep up with concepts that Grace presented as naturally as breathing. This changes everything, Emma whispered, staring at the final equation. If this is right, and I can see that it is, then half of quantum mechanics textbooks need to be rewritten. Professor Morrison is going to lose his mind. Grace set down the chalk, dusting her hands on the apron she wore over her uniform. Professor Morrison already knows this theory is possible. He's been circling around it for years, but his ego prevents him from admitting his foundational assumptions were wrong. That's why he's been so hard on you, Emma. Your questions threaten his life's work. Richard had been silent for the past hour, watching Grace teach with a mastery that made university professors look like amateurs. His phone had rung 6 times, important calls about mergers and acquisitions, but he'd ignored them all, transfixed by the transformation of the woman he dismissed as worthless into someone who could reshape humanity's understanding of physics. "Why my house?" he finally asked. "Of all the places you could have hidden, why choose to be my maid?" Grace turned to him with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, simply honest. "Because you were perfect. Wealthy enough to pay on time, self-absorbed enough to never really look at me, located close enough to Columbia's library that I could continue my research during my hours off. Your arrogance made you predictable, safe. I knew you'd never suspect I was using your Wi-Fi to access academic databases, never notice when I borrowed Emma's university credentials to download papers." She pulled out a battered notebook from her cleaning supplies, the same notebook Richard had seen her carry for 5 years, assuming it was for grocery lists or cleaning schedules. She opened it, revealing pages of dense mathematical proofs, theoretical frameworks, and references to papers in a dozen languages. "I've written 3 complete theories while cleaning your house," Grace said, showing them the notebook. "One on quantum entanglement that solves the Beijing paradox. Another on economic modeling that predicts market crashes with 97% accuracy. The third," she paused, looking at Richard, "is about the mathematics of human prejudice, how bias compounds like interest, creating systems of oppression that become self-perpetuating." Richard stood up, moving closer to look at the notebook, seeing for the first time the beautiful mind he'd had cleaning his toilets. "These could win Nobel Prizes. Multiple Nobel Prizes. Why haven't you published them?" "Under what name?" Grace asked. "Dr. Grace Okonkwo officially doesn't exist anymore. My credentials were tied to my work visa, which expired when I couldn't maintain my university position. Publishing would expose me to immigration authorities, to creditors still seeking payment for my daughter's medical bills, to a world I'm not ready to face again." She closed the notebook carefully. "So I clean houses and solve the universe's mysteries in my spare time." Emma suddenly grabbed her laptop, typing furiously. "No. This is wrong. This is all wrong. You can't be hiding here, wasting your brilliance on." She gestured helplessly at the cleaning supplies. "We have to fix this. Dad, you have lawyers, connections. We can resolve her immigration status, deal with the creditors." Richard nodded slowly, his business instincts finally aligning with something worthwhile. "I know Senator Williams. He owes me several favors. And the creditors, how much are we talking about?" $800,000, Grace said quietly. "The final bill for treatments that didn't work, for hope that cost everything and delivered nothing." Richard pulled out his phone, not to take a call but to make one. "Marcus? It's Richard Hartley. I need you to write a check for $800,000. Yes, now. Make it out to." He looked at Grace, full name. "Dr. Grace Adiz Okonkwo," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," Grace protested, stepping back. "I don't want your charity. I've never taken anything I haven't earned." "Then earn it," Richard said, his voice gaining strength. "Teach me to understand the mathematics behind my own business. Teach Emma to complete not just her thesis but to think at your level. Hell, teach my entire executive team to stop making stupid decisions based on flawed models. I'll pay you what you're worth, not as a maid, but as the genius you are." Grace looked at him skeptically. "Yesterday you were laughing about my stupidity to your golf buddies. You called me barely functional to your sister. You used me as an example of why education is wasted on certain people. Why should I believe this sudden transformation?" Richard set down his phone, facing the full weight of his prejudice for the first time. "Because I'm scared. Terrified, actually. I've built my entire identity on being the smartest person in the room, and I've just discovered I've been the stupidest. For 5 years, I had one of the world's most brilliant minds in my house, and I was too blinded by my own arrogance to see it. If I could be that wrong about you, what else am I wrong about?" The study fell quiet as Grace considered Richard's words, weighing 5 years of humiliation against the possibility of redemption. Emma watched the two of them, her thesis temporarily forgotten as she witnessed something rarer than any mathematical proof, a moment of genuine human reckoning. The afternoon light had turned golden, painting the equations on the board like hieroglyphs of transformation. "There's something else," Grace said finally, walking to the window that overlooked the manicured gardens she'd never had time to enjoy. "Your wife knows. Catherine has known who I am for 2 years." Richard's jaw dropped. "What? That's impossible. Catherine barely speaks to you except to give orders." Grace smiled slightly. "Catherine found my notebook once when I accidentally left it in the library. She recognized the mathematics, looked up my name, discovered my history. She's been protecting my secret, increasing my pay through bonuses you never noticed because you never review household expenses, ensuring I had access to academic journals through her alumni connections. She turned to face them. She wanted to tell you, but I begged her not to. I wasn't ready." Emma laughed, surprising everyone including herself. "Mom always said you were an idiot about people, Dad." Turns out she was being literal. As if summoned by her name, Catherine Hartley appeared in the doorway, elegant in her tennis outfit, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. I heard raised voices, then suspicious silence. I assume the truth has finally surfaced. She walked to Grace, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm glad. Keeping this secret has been eating me alive." Richard looked at his wife with new confusion. "Why didn't you tell me? Why let me make a fool of myself for 2 more years?" "Because you needed to discover your ignorance on your own," Catherine said simply. "If I'd told you, you would have found a way to make it about your generosity in employing a genius, about how progressive you were. You needed to face the full weight of your prejudice without an escape route." She looked at the board, understanding perhaps a tenth of what was written there. And Grace needed time to heal. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, even for geniuses. Grace moved away from the window, picking up the chalk one more time. She drew a simple equation at the bottom of the board, separate from the complex physics. "This is the formula for compound interest," she said. "Every act of kindness or cruelty compounds over time. Catherine's kindness, quiet and consistent, gave me the strength to continue. Your cruelty, Richard, casual and constant, nearly broke me several times." She set down the chalk. "The question is, what interest rate will you choose going forward?" Richard stood up, crossing to the board, picking up the eraser. But instead of erasing anything, he set it down again. "I want to keep this. All of it. As a reminder of the day I learned to see." He turned to Grace. "I'll pay off your debts today. Tomorrow, we incorporate a research foundation in your name. You'll have full autonomy, unlimited resources, and Emma as your first doctoral candidate. But more than that." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come naturally. "I apologize. Deeply and sincerely. Not just for how I treated you, but for who I've been." Grace studied him for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised everyone. "I'll stay. Not as your maid, though I'll continue to help with the house because I've grown fond of it. But as what I am, a researcher, a teacher, a human being deserving of respect regardless of my title or task." She looked at Emma. "Your defense is in 3 weeks. We have work to do. Real work, not the performance your professors expect but the truth the universe deserves." Over the following weeks, the Hartley household transformed. Grace moved from the small maid's quarters to the guest suite, though she often still cooked because she enjoyed it and was better at it than anyone they could hire. Emma's thesis defense became legendary in academic circles, not just for solving the Hartley-Chen Paradox but for acknowledging Dr. Grace Okonkwo as co-author, bringing her back from academic death with a resurrection that made international news. Richard, true to his word, established the Okonkwo Foundation for Theoretical Sciences, funded with $10 million of his personal wealth. But more importantly, he began taking lessons from Grace, not just in mathematics but in seeing the world without the filters of privilege and prejudice. It was humbling, often painful, but ultimately transformative. The story went viral when Emma posted about it online, with pictures of the equation-covered board and a photo of Grace in her maid's uniform standing next to her Wikipedia page. The response was overwhelming: offers from universities, book deals, speaking engagements. But Grace turned most of them down, choosing instead to work with students like Emma, brilliant minds who needed guidance more than fame. 6 months later, at Emma's graduation, Grace sat in the front row wearing a simple blue dress, her first new clothing purchase in 5 years. When Emma's name was called, when she walked across that stage as Dr. Emma Hartley, she stopped at the podium and said words that weren't in the script: "Everything I've achieved is because someone saw potential where others saw only service. Thank you, Dr. Okonkwo, for teaching me that brilliance isn't about who notices you, but about continuing to shine even when no one's looking." Richard, sitting beside Grace, had tears streaming down his face. Not from pride in his daughter, though that was there too, but from the profound humiliation and gratitude of a man who'd learned the hardest lesson of his life, that he'd been living in a palace of ignorance, served by queens and kings he'd mistaken for furniture. The maid he'd mocked for 5 years had saved not just his daughter's academic career but his own soul from the poverty of prejudice. The final image that would stay with everyone who heard this story was Grace at the blackboard in the Hartley study, still in her maid's uniform but transformed by the light of her own brilliance, proving that genius can survive any circumstance, that dignity cannot be destroyed by those too blind to see it, and that sometimes the person scrubbing your floors is simultaneously solving the mysteries of the universe, waiting for the world to be ready for their truth. As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Grace pulled out her old notebook, the one she'd carried while cleaning, and showed Emma the last page. It was an equation she'd been working on for 5 years, titled simply, "The Mathematics of Redemption." Below it, in Richard's shaky handwriting from his first lesson, were the words, "I don't know, but I'm ready to learn." The Okonkwo Foundation would go on to fund 27 PhD candidates from overlooked backgrounds, revolutionize 3 separate fields of physics, and prove definitively that talent is universal but opportunity is not. And in every publication, in every breakthrough, there would be a small note, "With gratitude to those who clean our spaces while we clean up our ignorance." Richard Hartley would spend the rest of his life telling this story, not as the hero but as the cautionary tale, the man who had genius cleaning his toilets because he couldn't see past his own reflection. But more importantly, he became the man who learned to see, who chose to change, who discovered that the most profound education often comes from the people we've been taught to ignore. Grace Okonkwo returned to the international stage not as the genius who'd disappeared but as the one who'd survived, who'd found strength in service, who'd proven that no circumstance can diminish a brilliant mind, only delay its recognition. She would win her Nobel Prize 5 years later, accepting it in a simple blue dress, thanking her daughter's memory, Catherine's kindness, Emma's courage, and even Richard's eventual humility for giving her the space to remember who she was when she was ready to be her again. The blackboard in Richard's study was never erased. It became a monument to the day assumptions died and understanding was born, the day a maid solved an impossible equation and a millionaire learned the hardest problem of all, how to truly see another human being.